Hi, I'm joined today by Wayne Parks, independent DDaT strategic advisor for policing. Wayne, we've known each other now for 20 odd years. You've got 30 years experience across policing, technology, digital leadership. You're a former senior executive in local, regional and national policing, and you specialise in police technology, digital transformation and, really importantly, national programmes. You're a trusted advisor across policing and you're known for challenging thinking and driving change. So welcome, Wayne. So in this podcast, Wayne, we want to explore the tension between local autonomy and national capability and examine why transformation has been difficult to achieve in the past and what we need to do to be able to make it work this time. So going back 7-8 years ago, there was a real drive triggered by a number of police forces in the UK, a trend towards unified control room solutions. And there was lots of benefits of that. And I kind of feel now we're at the cusp of changing from that as being the trend to being this, well, actually, dispatch and CAD, they sit really well together and they should be connected. But contact, because of the expectation of the public and because of the changes in technology and commercial CRM systems and AI, etc., it's almost like instead of going down that route of unification, when it comes to the contact piece, let's go this way and do something different with contact. And it worries me, it excites me, but it also worries me that the connection between the two, because it's really important to make that connection, that the workflow will be lost in that, so the customer's journey will be lost.
It's a really good point, because I think in some ways that policing have driven the market in the wrong direction.
Right.
By doing exactly as you've described there about your CAD suppliers will kindly do a bit more CRM, yeah, and they've built some of the basics, call handling. Then, you know, a huge organisation like Salesforce or somebody come in, it's their bread and butter. They do CRM globally at massive level, you know, so bringing that in, it's just like, well, this isn't very good now. You know, I've got all these other things that come with that. So I think it is a change in position now that people are looking at it a different way. And I think the CAD, the dispatch, the managing resources element has suffered because of that.
Yeah.
So a lot of development cost has gone into adding to CRM type capabilities, contact capabilities into their CAD system rather than more, particularly with AI, you know, the clever stuff that can bring about, the big picture of the almost the chaos that goes on in policing every day, to bring some insight and sense into that. I think it has suffered exactly as you've described because of that. But I think we are at that tipping point, as we've talked about a little bit about the two very different disciplines.
Yeah, and I think that I'm interested to know what your view is of this, but the white paper to me kind of indicated towards, or maybe I'm reading between the lines, but indicated towards the opportunity to do contact handling, maybe at more of a national scale, or at least not necessarily linking it to whatever the future police force look like, linking it to be like for like with the police force, and I think that's just going to drive that shift. So instead of it being unification, it's more around let's have a standardized, maybe even just one platform, a single platform across the country for contact management. With my sort of taxpayer hat on, and put that makes a lot of sense. Of just mandating one application, one system across the country. You mentioned Salesforce, it could be something like that, it could be somewhere else. It could be that there's a standard model and there's maybe 2 or 3 vendors to be able to make sure there's competitiveness there, but they've got to comply with standard model. But do you think that's going to happen? Do you think that's likely?
I think there's a chance, yeah. I think the white paper hints at lots and it isn't clear, you know, because it's not, they're not doing the work at the moment, you know, but my fear again is, are all those hints that are in the reform paperwork, is somebody now doing the more detailed analysis to say, what does some of that look like? So that's a concern at the moment in terms of taking those to the next level, because I think that's what should be happening now, of exploring some of those opportunities that are outlined. But, you know, technology's moved on so quickly now, it's created new opportunities as well. So looking at it in a different way to do those type of things. And, there are some new entrants come into the market. Policing is it's a little bit of a closed shop, or has been, to a lot of the big suppliers. You talk about procurement, it's almost too difficult. The national ask, even as a national, it's not huge to a lot of companies.
No.
Even if you do national UK policing as a one thing, let alone breaking it up into little segments, that makes it very costly for any organisation to come in. So I think that's definitely stifled the market in many, many ways. And procurement remains really difficult, I think, across policing. From your side, and now I work on outside of policing, for the last kind of 4 years, and I see a lot of tenders coming out that just make it really difficult.
Yeah,
they're not going to get the best outcomes, in my view.
Absolutely, and I think we have seen a bit of a change, and some forces are very good at this, and some are a bit behind the curve on this, but around shifting towards outcome-based procurement.
Yeah.
Because you and I will have a lot of experience of very prescriptive tenders that you must, within 3 button clicks, do this, and so many milliseconds for this change, and the button must be pink or red,
they describe the current system.
Exactly.
So you're going to get more of what you had,
or they describe the system they've seen.
Yes.
And yeah, absolutely. But I think that generally speaking is a thing of the past. I don't think that really happens very frequently anymore. But I don't feel that they've really crossed that chasm towards genuinely having outcomes-based. And I think it's a confidence thing. They won't have the confidence to go out and say, we're not going to prescribe or describe in detail what we want. We're going to describe the outcome we're trying to achieve, or the problem we're trying to address, and allow suppliers to explain how they would tackle that. And I think that takes a leap of faith and that trust, because the suppliers maybe can explain it, but maybe not deliver it. How can we fix that?
It's not an easy one, because you've got to evaluate it fairly. So evaluation drives specifics. That's the problem with some of this. So I think, but again, we've talked about learning from others quite a bit in this session. Let's go outside of even public sector. There's lots of people do this. You can do it, but it's a different kind of mindset. The mindset about marking in a very traditional way as, do they meet this, don't they meet that, doesn't lend itself to, you very much need to look for the right partner to co-create with you, to build something together.
Yeah.
But how do you get that at a competitive price? How do you drive competition into that? How do you ensure you get what you want? Because the history has not been great of trying to do some of that. It's ended up very expensive, and many times in the past not delivered what they needed. So I think that there's a real fear about that. There's also something you touched on, I think, which is still a fear about the national. So from the local to the national bit is, well, that doesn't mean we want, or we should have one of everything. My question would be, why not? Because again, if you look at other sectors, let's think outside of policing. So John Lewis or somebody doesn't say, well, we're going to have multiple HR systems, to maintain competition, to maintain, innovation and all those type of things. Lots of other industries manage that very, very effectively. You've got to have a point where it's recompeted and all that kind of stuff. But it seems to drive, because we can't do the procurement and the commercial well, it drives we've got to have multiple systems of it then.
Yeah, and I think we've seen, the only one I can think of that hasn't been in the commercial sector where it has been sort of mandated is probably the ambulance radio program, where they went through a similar consolidation. A number of ambulance services across the nation consolidated down to 15, I think it was at the time, and mandated that the dispatch side of things, or at least the radio dispatch side of things, was a particular vendor's solution. And I think in some respects that's a success, because it took away all those different projects and different procurements and different tenders that each of the ambulance trusts would have been going out for their own system. But then in other ways, probably A, it took a long time to get delivered, and B, when it gets delivered, is it really meeting the need? And I'm not specifically saying the ambulance radio program one, but meeting the need that was intended when they asked for it, because it's taken so long. And then the recompete part of it, I kind of question whether, unless we do go down this a mandated route from the centre, I can't imagine a world in policing where CAD and dispatch is national systems yet. I find that hard to see.
Yeah, I think the reality is that's difficult to see that happening. But we mustn't lose sight of, is that the right thing to do? I think you mentioned it earlier on about what would the public expect? That they would look at some of that and thinking, well, that sounds mad. That sounds like wasted money, inefficiency. You're trying to get things to work together, spending money on interoperability and all the other things. Why isn't it just one? You know, so I think it's very easy to kind of step back and say, oh, that's too hard or too much risk. I think this is the tipping point now. I think this is the absolute once in a generation type opportunity with police reform to say, why aren't we doing those type of things? Because it works all over the world, you know. So how did Dutch police then, how did they deal with that issue? Why aren't we, and there, you know, theirs was 10 years ago or something, I think, something like that. You know, so what have they learned through that? How have they resolved some of those things? How do we leapfrog that, you know, in terms of, because the danger is we'll just, another 10 years, we'll be following the same journey as somebody like the Dutch police, you know, and going through all those learnings one by one. But because I think there's just massive opportunity in some of that about, and I think that's back to the merging without transformation, building national capability that everybody moves to, that's the way I think to be able to achieve the merging agenda, but also the transformation. And I think it makes it a whole lot easier to be able to do some of that. I know that brings a lot of change. And I think there's something about timing here, because if I think back to the national programme I led, NEP, so the 365 rollout, the timing was almost perfect. 365 was coming from Microsoft. Forces were starting to look at it. It was the bit behind NEP was policing started to consume public cloud.
Yeah.
You know, because we're going back a while now. We're going back to 2016 when we're having that conversation. So that was the real problem behind, you know, NEP was a vehicle and 365 was the vehicle to address some of that. But it was just starting to come in. So it was a time to grab it and saying, 2 or 3 forces had tried bits of it, having some issues with national accreditation and all that kind of stuff. You know, we grabbed it at the centre and said, let's do this once. Still deployed locally at that time. But let's do a single design, a single blueprint and deploy it locally. And it worked.
Yeah.
You know, so I think there's precedence for being able to doing that. And I know the 365 platform's a bit different, it's a big productivity tool. But I think we've missed opportunities like facial recognition. You know, we've proved the technology, we've proved the ethics of it in many ways. You know, we've got all the stuff, the number of forces gone through that pain, you know, grab that and roll it out wider, you know. So I think there's opportunities and all of that. And that's where police reform to me is such a big opportunity now and you can't do everything. I get that, you know, there's too much change to do at once. But what are some of the key things we now need, you know, what policing should be doing now to enable transformation and merging? If
you got your way, which I interpret it as being that you would encourage a sort of a national agenda on the transformation side, and then they will come when it comes with the mergers. So focus on the transformation, and mergers will be a byproduct of the transformation. If you do that first, or at least have a vision, an agenda, a roadmap for that, then the merging of police forces is kind of like quite a simple thing on paper. Reality is difficult.
Well, if you think about something like ERP, so there's loads of forces battling with ERP, either to deliver something, doing options analysis. I've been involved in 3 forces, 3 collaborations, looking at ERP options. So they've all spent money with a consultancy to look at what are their ERP options, you know, going forward. What are some of the biggest issues going to be around merging is around finance and people.
Yeah.
You know, so going back to that timing issue, you know, that to me is almost a perfect example. And there are a number of forces looking at a common product now around this, you know. So to me, there's a great opportunity to grab that and say, right, you know, because all the money that's being spent around that at the moment is almost wasted. You know, because it's looking at options, it's starting projects, it's doing things, saying, let's deliver this nationally. But it's picking the right things, isn't it? That's the key.
And it's got to be, I think, it's got to be centrally led, centrally mandated, because there's been other initiatives that have been quite successful where a number of forces have the same RMS system, and maybe it's Niche or Athena or whatever, and they start to want to collaborate more, and then they create a group, and then you get things like the Minerva one for niche standardization, so it starts to allow a database structure in one force to match the same as another, so you can share information, but it becomes organic, and it's really really hard. It gets there in the end, and it does allow competition to stay in the market, because I think that was my big concern, if I'm honest, around going on a single solution, is that vendors will just not look at the UK or look at England and Wales anymore. They will look elsewhere, and whilst we talk, and we've talked today around looking at what other countries are doing and maybe copying them because it works, the reality is I think in each of those countries they've ended up with something that's quite unique for them, maybe with a banner of a brand of a company that's globally recognized of providing CRM or whatever it may be, but they've tailored it to an extreme level to meet their needs. So if we did that, we'd have to have such a centralized organization. Who do you think would lead that? Where would that be? Is that PDS, or is that where would that sort of? Well,
it naturally aligns to the new body of the National Police Service. You know, that's it's going to try and do that. Things like PDS and lots of the other agencies at the centre will get consumed into that body over time. So that again gives a mechanism to do this finally. That because the centre is so fragmented at the moment with so many different organisations, it's very difficult to get anything done. So that's another enabler to actually make this happen, to bring that together. And I think we've got to look at where technology is going, because, it's becoming much more platform-based, it's becoming much more selecting the organisation, and working with them, in terms of they've got the right platform. Does that limit competition? Yes, it will do in some ways, but this sounds a little bit insular in many ways. If it's the right partner, is that a major problem? If they go with you and you develop something, then, or you keep developing it, should I say, it keeps modernising, innovating and that kind of stuff, and it works. Then there's two sides to that. I can see exactly where you're coming from, but it's which is the worst, I guess, isn't it? About, are you restricting competition, or you actually delivering something really good in policing? That there's two sides to that, isn't there? And I don't know the answer to that. No. Exactly where that line falls, but things like, I don't know, Microsoft's a bit different with something like 365. It's a kind of there's not many global de facto standard, isn't it? In terms of doing something like Outlook, but there are people moving away now from elements of 365. And re-looking at licensing. So although that's there, that hasn't stifled competition. There's two people doing bits, and people are moving away from parts of it to do other things. So, but it's a line where that sits. I don't know in my own head at the moment. But if it gets in the way of doing the right thing, that's when it starts to become a problem to me. I think that it's just cyclic for me. I think there'll be potentially huge benefit from standardising on particular applications nationally. For a period of time, and you might be lucky and have that relationship with that vendor that's so tight that it really is a transformational partnership, and that absolutely can be the case, and you can see that in place. But also, it doesn't necessarily end up being the case, and then you feel a bit trapped, or you feel that it's hard to then. You're very sticky, or they're sticky, and it's hard to break out and bring somebody else in, and that somebody else, that other vendor, has probably isn't at that stage looking at the UK as being viable because it's so single supplied sort of mindset. And I think some of that comes back to procurement and commercials as well, because very rarely, so I'm starting to see some of it now, that any of the tenders I'm seeing now on the outside looking in talk about exit, talk about transition, because that the enabler to innovation should be we can move from X supplier to Y supplier seamlessly, and it's kind of their responsibility to make that happen. I don't see that coming out as requirements very, very often. I have seen it now, so it has changed a little bit, particularly with some of the big cloud vendors,
Yeah.
the lock-in is a massive challenge then about
Yeah.
how do we move our data, how do we transition all of this then to somebody else to drive better value, whatever that may be, or some innovation coming along. So I think that's also part of it, about how do we construct it correctly to enable that to happen.
No, you touched on there with the cloud. I haven't really thought about that, but yeah, you'd need to ensure that you can switch quite seamlessly from one to another, and you bring that down to more the discrete sort of niche applications, and trying to replicate that model.
So for new vendor to challenge Azure and AWS that comes in, an Oracle or whatever, something saying we're going to give you really, really good pricing on something coming in, thinking, great, that would save us loads of money. How do we actually transition to that then? I would suggest with a lot of it, almost impossible at the moment, because it's so embedded and so using core bits of some of those big cloud providers. And I'm looking at the same thing in two angles, saying it's difficult to change, and I'm saying, well, don't change, but finding that line, I think, is quite difficult.
Yeah, and I think that line will be different depending on what the need is. Yeah. And right now, you could argue that we need to make a step change in the control rooms. I'm curious what I think of having that mandated as being these applications are for CAD, this application is for dispatch, this is for your contact, and building that, and then allowing forces to join onto it. Presumably that would pretty much all be cloud, or at least have cloud as being the routine, and maybe some sort of on-premise fallback if needed.
And I think why I'm challenging both to you, Simon, and to other people talking about it, could we have one? Because it's almost ruled out without thinking about it. We can't just have one of everything, because that we won't have innovation. Well, have we really thought about that? Have we really tested that? Is there a way around that? Can we do it differently? It's almost been a default now for 20 years. They say we couldn't have one CAD for the UK. My question
we tried that with NSPIS, didn't we?
Yeah. But a different construct now. If we think about what reform is going to deliver, you end up with, say it's 9 forces, based on government regions or something. You end up with 9 leaders and not 43. So that is an enabler in itself, in terms of new organisational structure and decision makers, makes it somewhat easier, and that could mean long term anyway, you're going to have 9 CAD systems, and that might be acceptable. But I just tried to challenge the thinking to say this is the time to think differently.
My perspective is a little bit different. I kind of think that my fear would be that going down one solution wouldn't encourage innovation. And if you go to like an extreme case, maybe AI, where there's lots of innovation at the moment. So there's loads of applications coming out every other week, or services that would allow a police force to be able to improve in a certain area with AI, whether it's transcription, translation, whether it's the back end, the front end, whatever it may be. And if we were to hypothetically sort of dictate, we'll only use this type of AI, very quickly you'd be choosing not to use other AI that's better, because it's changing so rapidly. And I think that's starting to happen, or can happen, with CAD. Just the UK hasn't seen it.
So I think that's about how you build around your core platform. So what does the core look like? And let's continue the CAD debate. So you've got your core CAD, that's your core platform. There's a whole load of big parts that's all around the data and what you're doing with it. So how do you build the ecosystem with some clever innovators around the edges of that appears seamless to the CAD operator? Because if somebody's doing a risk assessment on something as an AI tool over here, and is presented through your CAD, it doesn't have to be the same supplier.
Yeah.
But it needs to, and this is the big part that we haven't touched on a lot at the moment, to make all of this happen properly is going to be interoperability.
And you
that's the key issue.
Completely. And you mentioned platform there, and I think that there's either a platform that a particular vendor has that they've developed their own ecosystem, their platform, and there's open interfaces maybe to it to encourage third-party innovation through it and its services within the platform. But then you could take one step further, and the platform is actually not a vendor's platform. It's the police force's platform or the government's platform, and the government sort of decide what that looks like, how it works, how it functions, where the data is going to be, etc. And it's taking that the architecture of the solution, extrapolating it away from a vendor's individual CAD or so and so or whatever, and saying this is how we're going to manage our data, and we need to have a capability that does this. I am all for that. I think that would be really exciting and encourage innovation, because where you can plug into it and where you can get data from it, those small organizations, those startups, those bigger ones that want to move into a different sector, they will innovate and they will fund that. But only if that platform is, not if it's just open because it's got open AI, open interfaces, but it's open because it's government owned. In the sense that that it's fair.
And I guess something like LEDs is a good example of that, PNC replacement. So there's a clue in the title, isn't there? Law enforcement data system, that's the core platform, and it does a lot more than that. It does workflow and it does lots of other things. But long term, it doesn't have to do all of that. It's had to do that to replace PNC, to replicate the functionality. If it goes, the original vision of LEDs is that's the data system, you build the ecosystem around it, or suppliers can build the ecosystem saying, we can do this clever thing with that LEDs data, to deliver you this type of capability. That's kind of how I see it all working together. The answer's a little bit that, how do you get innovation? Because, LEDs, it's government owned, it's going to be there for many, many years. Hopefully not as long as PNC kind of sat there, with a lot of modernisation going on, but it gets modernised as it goes along. That's a big part of that ecosystem then, isn't it? About where does that kind of data come from?
It all comes back to big, bold decisions to me. It comes back to having confidence at a senior level and an understanding, sufficient understanding to be able to make the right decisions, but direct it from the top. And in the past, my experience has probably been that a big, bold idea gets diluted quite rapidly and becomes something like, we'll just merge some forces. And that's a tick in the box to say we've done it. How can we get that big, bold decision to carry on?
It's a bit chicken and egg, isn't it? Because achieving the mergers gives you less decision makers in the system that probably enables big, bold decision making then, because you've got, let's continue with the 9. If there's 9 forces, I have no idea how many there's going to be, but it's easier to make some of those big, bold decisions. We're going to do all this together, but that's 5-7 years down the line, isn't it, until you get to that point. So the environment now to try and make those big, bold decisions is mandation's the only real option, and that mandation comes from Home Office, from government, to actually do some of those things. So is there an appetite for that? I don't feel like there's an appetite for that. It talks about it. Again, it's another one of those mentions in the white paper. It does talk about those things, but doesn't give any clarity on that. So, it goes back to my overall fear is, we wait for the bold decisions for another 7 years while we're merging. That doesn't feel like the right thing to do. And I guess it comes back to who's going to make those bold decisions. And I don't see that at the moment in terms of, who's sat in the chair of reform that's going to make those bold decisions. There's lots of changes going on in the Home Office, some new leadership will be coming in. So I think there's a little bit of waiting for that to happen. What does that look like? My encouragement to policing, particularly the tech community, would be, while there's a bit of a gap, grab that space, start to come up with what some of that could look like, and some of those ideas, in terms of how it could move forward. I think there's a massive opportunity, I think, for supplier community, for individual forces, for everybody out there to grab some of that space and momentum at the moment, because I don't think any of it's been decided yet. There's opportunities everywhere.
I worry that it just popped in my head, fire control. So
Yes.
fire control was an example of the government mandating we are going to have standard systems, standard buildings, same building design. I can't remember, it was 7, I think it was, or maybe even more. But fire control centres across the UK, and they will have this CAD system. They will have this dispatch system. They will. And a change of government and a bit of a failed program, a complete U-turn, and instead it was, okay, we'll free up this money, and fire services, if you collaborate, you get more of the pocket of cash to be able to do something with either your neighbouring police force or with neighbouring fire service, which tended to be the thing to do. And all that really took was, okay, the program wasn't going very well, but all it really took was to do complete U-turn was a change in government.
Yeah.
So to me, this whole reform program, it's such a, from a supplier's perspective, how long do we wait to get confidence that it's going to be real? Yeah. Or do we wait, or do we jump in with both feet and really embrace it with the risk that it'll all get canned?
So politics is a big risk in all of this, absolutely, in terms of government changes, leadership changes. As soon as something starts to become a little unpopular, the foot goes off the gas, because of that short-termism, and when things start to go and there's bad press about it, there's stuff all over social media, then it's just like, what are we going to do about this? We've seen that with police reform a number of times now, the regionalisation, going back, how long ago was that? 10, 12 years ago?
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that. And, I was heavily involved in that at the time. That was all go, change of leadership, change of government, ultimately. It all goes out the window and it goes off another. So that is a risk. But I think in terms of your point about, it's a bit of Hobson's choice, isn't it? Do you wait for something to happen?
Yeah. My
advice to any suppliers at the moment would be, try to get something around the art of the possible and what that could bring and benefits. Start to influence now, because the thinking hasn't been done, the detail certainly isn't there in terms of what it's going to look like. So start to shape some of that thinking, because will it happen? Nobody knows. As we started this conversation, that it seems to be the best opportunity I've ever seen in terms of,
it does.
There's so many people saying this has got to happen now. We can't carry on doing this. We're trying to police global crime in 43 segments of geography, does not make any sense anymore. So the best opportunity I've seen in my, 34 years now I've been around policing.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I'm genuinely, both with a supplier hat on and just a member of the public, thinking that it feels like there's got to be, whether it goes to the extent of what we would like it to be, is probably unlikely, but there's got to be significant change, because staying as we are just isn't an option. No. Or staying even close to what we are isn't an option. Through any lens, whether it's the number of police forces, or whether it's the command and control systems that we've got, or whether it's the contact handling that's rudimentary, or whatever it may be. Yeah. Every single bit of the piece you look at needs to have a step change. So for me, it's just going to stimulate so much innovation initially. But I think that my fear is that it stimulates the innovation. There's a mad rush to be able to be the one that's selected, and then we're left with that partnership for too long. And then the innovation won't either be delivered that they're promised, or it'll be delivered, but the world's innovated even further.
It's certainly the history, isn't it, of policing. That's tends to what happened. But I'm very excited as well. I think this is a massive opportunity for policing. It's at the end of my career, and I'll be long gone to the hills before this is delivered. But I think it's the biggest opportunity I've seen in my time, and I think there is so much opportunity. It's just how brave now people want to be.
It did, just to sort of to try and end this podcast on a sort of visionary sort of a thought. In 12 to 18 months, if you can, a bit of putting you on the spot, but what would you hope we look like in the policing world around control rooms, and in 12 to 18 months, what do you hope that we have?
I mean, I think it's quite a short period, 12 to 18 months in policing terms, but I would hope that the ambition that's set out in the white paper has turned into some reality. So there's some certainty about some of the things we've discussed today, and that there's not a right and a wrong to lots of that, but I hope that there is some bold decision making in terms of doing some things fundamentally different. So, I think in that 12 to 18 months, a plan, some leadership, some clear direction that can then be, delivered, because it's not going to happen overnight. This is a huge piece of work. It needs momentum, it needs pace. There is, to end on a bit of a positive, there is some great stuff going on in policing. There's some real innovative thinking. Technology's moved on and is moving on so quickly, and things are being delivered at pace, which is very different to how it has been done. So, and there are some new good leaders out there in policing now. There's been quite a seed. My generation now have all come to retirement and moving on. There's some new, really, really good people out there who are driving some of this now, and quite a few of those have come from outside of policing. They're not the 30-year people like me, so they're bringing some new thinking and some innovation, some challenge about doing things differently. So I think I'm despite we've talked about risk and quite negative things often about the challenges and the way things are going on, I'm still optimistic, Simon, that this can happen and make a massive difference to policing, but most importantly, a better service to the communities.
I think my takeaway, just reflecting on what you've been saying today, has been the thing that's sort of going to stay with me is this, and I'm paraphrasing, but for this transformation before or ahead of or prioritise transformation over merging or over the geography side of things. And I think that really, I just hope that is the way that they go. And there's a real focus and impetus, and it's constructed in a way that really, at the offset, really encourages and allows innovative organisations with ideas to come into that conversation, rather than it's something that's done behind closed doors and then announced we're going to transform, rather than actually getting some of that knowledge from suppliers into that.
Well, most of it's going to be delivered through suppliers, so they need to be part of it. Policing need to be looking at those new ideas, what can bring in, and extend that engagement. I don't think there's a lot of engagement out at the moment from the centre, so there needs to be more of that. Yeah, absolutely. And that should include suppliers. Yeah. Be interesting to see how they do that. It's going to be an interesting period. It is, isn't it? Yeah. Well, thank you very, very much for joining us today. I think it's been a pleasure. Obviously, and we go back 20 odd years, and we see each other regularly at events and that. But it's really nice to have some time to talk and share some of your insights. So thank you very much for joining us. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you.